I am Margaret Holloway, and I am 55 years old. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment in Willow Creek Heights, Ohio, a quiet neighborhood tucked between a grocery plaza and a row of aging maple trees. It is not a place anyone would describe as impressive. The walls are thin, the heating works only when it wants to, and the elevator breaks down at least once every winter. But this apartment has been my refuge for over 2 decades. It is where I raised my son. It is where I survived abandonment, exhaustion, and silence. And it is where my life changed forever. Before we continue, please like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Stories like this reach people who have given everything quietly, loved deeply without applause, and carried pain without complaint. Your support helps these stories find the people who need them. For 26 years, I raised my son Evan Holloway by myself. His father left when Evan was just 6 years old. There was no dramatic argument, no slammed doors, no tears. One morning, he stood in the doorway with 2 suitcases and said he wasn't ready for responsibility. He said he needed to find himself. He promised he would call. He never did. No birthdays. No holidays. No child support. Evan waited for a while. Then he stopped asking. And I learned that some men leave quietly, but the damage they cause is loud and lifelong. After my husband left, fear became my closest companion. Fear of eviction. Fear of hunger. Fear of failing the small boy who depended on me for everything. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I had rent due. I had school supplies to buy. I had a child who needed stability even when my own world had collapsed. I took a full-time job as a records coordinator at Lakeshore Medical Pavilion. My shift started at 6:30 every morning. I would wake Evan before dawn, make him oatmeal, braid his hair when he was younger, and walk him to the neighbor's apartment before rushing to catch the bus. By 2:30 in the afternoon, I clocked out and crossed town to my second job at Benson and Row Department Store, where I worked evenings until nearly 9 p.m. Some nights, especially during holidays, I didn't get home until after 10. Most nights, Evan was already asleep when I returned. I would sit at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea, still wearing my coat, too tired to even take off my shoes. I learned to function on exhaustion. It became my normal. I stopped buying new clothes for myself. I cut my hair at discount salons that advertised $17.99 specials. I stopped replacing shoes until the soles were nearly gone. When coworkers talked about vacations or spa days, I smiled politely, knowing those things were not meant for me. Every dollar I earned went to Evan. Good notebooks, proper shoes, school trips, tutoring when he struggled with math. I wanted him to have everything I never had: security, opportunity, confidence. Evan was a gentle child. He never complained. He learned early not to ask for too much. When he wanted something expensive, he would hesitate before bringing it up, already calculating whether it was worth the sacrifice. That broke my heart more than any unpaid bill ever could. When Evan was accepted into Ridgewell University, a private school with a reputation that carried weight, I cried in the bus terminal. The tuition was terrifying. I had no savings, no backup, but I refused to let fear steal his future. I sold my car, a 12-year-old sedan that had carried us through everything. After that, I took public transportation everywhere. Rain, snow, heat waves, it didn't matter. Every mile was worth it if it meant Evan could walk across that campus with his head held high. Evan studied relentlessly. He went on to law school. I kept working 2 jobs. I never took a vacation. I never complained. When Evan graduated and accepted a position at Hawthorne, Reed & Collis, one of Cleveland's most respected law firms, I cried harder than I had when he was born. In that moment, every sacrifice felt justified. 3 years later, Evan called me and said he wanted me to meet someone important. Her name was Lydia Carver. The first time Lydia came to my apartment, I made a roast chicken with rosemary potatoes. She arrived wearing a tailored cream dress and heels that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She was tall, blonde, polished, someone who looked like she belonged in magazines and boardrooms. She smiled beautifully when Evan was watching. But when he turned away, her expression changed. The warmth drained from her eyes. Her face went blank, almost bored. I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe the best. Evan was in love. Lydia worked as a brand strategist at Northwell and Company, an elite consulting firm. She spoke often about international travel, Barcelona, Vienna, Milan. She talked about high-profile clients and luxury retreats. She never asked about my life. When I tried to join conversations, she responded politely but briefly, then redirected attention back to herself. My sister June noticed it too. After one family dinner, she pulled me aside and whispered that Lydia felt cold. I defended her. I said maybe she was nervous. Maybe she just needed time. But there were moments I couldn't ignore. Once, at a restaurant, Evan went to the restroom and Lydia leaned toward me and said I had food on my blouse. Her tone wasn't helpful. It was sharp, almost amused. I felt like a child being scolded. When Evan returned, her smile reappeared instantly. For Evan's 30th birthday, I baked his favorite hazelnut chocolate cake. It was a family recipe, one I had made for him since he was little. I brought it to his apartment, proud and hopeful. Lydia opened the door, glanced at the cake, and said Evan was avoiding sugar now. She placed it on the counter without telling him. No one touched it all evening. I washed the pan before I left. Evan never knew. A year later, Evan proposed. He called me right after it happened, his voice shaking with excitement. He said Lydia was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. I congratulated him. I meant it, but something inside me tightened. A quiet warning I didn't know how to name. The wedding planning began immediately, and I was invisible. Lydia and her mother took control of everything. The venue, the planner, the catering, the guest list. When Evan asked if I wanted to help, I said yes. But Lydia never called. I wasn't invited to dress fittings, cake tastings, or planning meetings. When I asked Evan about it, he said Lydia had everything handled and I shouldn't stress. I didn't push. I didn't want to cause problems. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday in June at St. Augustine's Cathedral, with over 200 guests invited. I bought a navy silk dress from a department store downtown. It was the most expensive thing I had purchased for myself in years. I wanted to look worthy of standing beside my son on the most important day of his life. The rehearsal dinner was held the night before at a private restaurant near the river. I spent the entire week preparing a gift for Evan, a leather-bound photo album filled with memories from his life. His first steps, his first day of school, his college acceptance letter. I wrote small notes beside each photo, explaining the moment, the feeling, the pride. When I arrived at the restaurant, Lydia was standing near the entrance speaking with the wedding planner. She saw me and walked over. She looked flawless in white. I handed her the gift and said softly that I had made something special for Evan. She took it from my hands. She didn't open it. Instead, she leaned closer and lowered her voice so only I could hear. "Starting tomorrow," she whispered, "you won't be part of this family anymore." My body went cold. She said my role was finished. That Evan was her husband now. That I was unnecessary. Excess baggage. She suggested it would be better if I didn't attend the wedding to avoid drama. Then she smiled and walked away. I stood there frozen, watching her disappear into the crowd, holding the life I had wrapped with love. I turned around and walked out. I went home alone. And that was the last quiet moment before everything collapsed. Sleep never came that night. The apartment felt too quiet, like the walls themselves were listening. The city outside moved on as usual. Cars passing, sirens in the distance, someone laughing on the sidewalk. But inside, everything had stopped. Lydia's words kept replaying in my head, each time sharper than before. Excess baggage. History. Don't come. The dress I had bought for the wedding hung on the inside of my closet door, still wrapped in plastic. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Every time I looked at it, my chest tightened. That dress had represented pride, love, and a moment I had waited for my entire adult life. Now it felt like proof that I had been foolish to believe I belonged. Morning came without warning. My body woke up before my mind did, trained by decades of routine. Coffee brewed automatically. I sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug, staring at nothing. The sun filtered through the blinds, lighting up dust particles in the air. Everything looked ordinary. That made it worse. The phone started buzzing around 9. First a cousin, then an aunt, then my sister June. I didn't answer. Each vibration felt like pressure against a bruise. What could I say? That the woman my son was marrying had erased me with a whisper? That I had been told to disappear? Saying it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready to face. Then Evan called. His name lit up the screen, and my heart cracked open. His voice in my mind was always steady, always calm. I imagined him standing somewhere in the church, looking around, wondering where his mother was. The thought made me nauseous. I let the call go to voicemail. He called again, and again. Each message sounded more worried than the last. He asked if I was okay. He said people were asking for me. He said the ceremony would start soon, and he needed me there. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. The truth sat heavy in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to place it in his hands, not on his wedding day. I believed, wrongly, that staying silent would protect him. At around 10:30, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't gentle. It was urgent. Through the peephole, June stood in full church attire, hat, gloves, heels, her face tight with concern. When I opened the door, she stopped short. I was still in pajamas. Hair undone. Eyes swollen. The contrast between us said everything. "Why aren't you dressed?" she asked. "The wedding starts in an hour." I stepped aside and let her in. The moment the door closed, everything poured out. The rehearsal dinner. The gift. Lydia's whisper. The way she smiled afterward as if nothing had happened. June didn't interrupt. She paced the room, hands clenched, her face slowly turning red. She said, "What?" June asked finally. When I repeated Lydia's words, June stopped pacing. Her voice dropped, controlled but dangerous. She had no right. I shook my head and told her I couldn't go. I couldn't sit in a church and watch my son marry someone who saw me as something to be discarded. I said I would break if I tried. June sat beside me and took my hands. Then she stood. "I'm going back to that church," she said. "And this ends today." I begged her not to cause a scene. I didn't want Evan's wedding ruined. June looked at me with a mix of sadness and resolve. "This already is ruined," she said. "He just doesn't know it yet." She left just before 11. The church bells began ringing shortly after. Each sound felt like a countdown to something irreversible. I imagined Evan at the altar, adjusting his cuffs. I imagined Lydia preparing to walk down the aisle, calm and confident, believing she had already won. And I sat alone, crying into my hands. At noon, the phone rang again. This time, it was June. Her voice was breathless. Fast. Different. "There is no wedding," she said. The words didn't register at first. I asked her to repeat herself. "It's over," she said. Evan called it off. Then she told me everything. Lydia had been cheating. Not once. Not briefly. For months. The man was Marcus Vaughn, a senior executive at her firm. Evidence surfaced at the church. Photos, dates, messages. Clear enough that denial lasted only minutes. Evan confronted Lydia in a side room. She denied it, then minimized it, then blamed stress. She begged him to go through with the ceremony. And then something else came out. A prenuptial agreement. One that gave Lydia's financially collapsing family access to Evan's future income. Lydia's father had lost millions in failed investments. Evan wasn't just a husband. He was a financial lifeline. When Evan read the document, something in him snapped. He walked out to the altar and announced the wedding was canceled due to betrayal. Chaos followed. Lydia screamed. Her parents threatened lawsuits. Guests argued. Some left immediately. Others stayed just to watch the fallout. June said Evan stood there, devastated but clear. At 3 p.m, the doorbell rang again. Evan stood there in his tuxedo. His tie was loosened. His eyes were red. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the day had folded him inward. He didn't speak. He just hugged me. The sob that escaped him was raw, unfiltered. He cried like he had when he was little and scraped his knees, except this time, there was nothing I could fix. When he finally pulled back, he asked if I had known. I told him the truth. Then I told him what Lydia had whispered to me. His face drained of color. "That's why she told everyone you were sick," he said quietly. She had told guests I had the flu. She said I called her crying and begged her not to make a big deal out of it. Everyone believed her. The realization hurt Evan more than the affair. "She was trying to cut you out," he said. Slowly. Quietly. The days that followed were brutal. Lydia went public. She posted a long message online, painting herself as the abandoned bride. She hinted that Evan was unstable. She suggested that his overbearing mother had influenced his decision. She didn't name me. She didn't have to. People stared at me in grocery stores. Old acquaintances whispered. Some stopped me outright and asked if it was true that I ruined my son's wedding. Evan's job became tense. One senior partner had connections to Lydia's family. Comments were made. Doubts were planted. 10 days later, a certified letter arrived. A lawsuit. Defamation. Emotional distress. Interference. They demanded money. They wanted silence. Evan received one too. I cried on the phone, telling him this was my fault. He said one sentence I will never forget. "Mom, protecting you isn't ruining my life. Losing you would have." That night, help arrived in the form of Nora Blake, a legal paralegal and longtime family friend. She read the documents carefully, then laughed, not kindly. "This is intimidation," she said. "They're broke. They're bluffing." And for the first time since the rehearsal dinner, hope flickered. Because truth, when documented, has a way of breaking lies wide open. The weeks that followed felt heavier than anything that came before. The wedding was over, but the damage lingered like smoke after a fire. Silence didn't return to my life. It was replaced by whispers, side glances, and half-truths that spread faster than facts ever could. Lydia's version of the story had already taken root online, and once a lie gains an audience, it doesn't need proof to survive. People I had known for years began to treat me differently. At Mapleway Fresh Market, conversations stopped when I walked past. Some neighbors smiled too politely, the way people do when they're unsure whether to believe what they've heard. Others weren't subtle at all. One woman asked outright if it was true that I had emotionally manipulated my son into canceling his wedding. Her tone wasn't curious, it was accusatory. Explaining myself felt useless. Lydia's post had thousands of likes and comments. Sympathy poured in for her. Words like abandoned, humiliated, and heartbroken followed her name everywhere. Mine was never mentioned, yet somehow always present, an unnamed villain hiding behind the scenes. Evan tried to shield me, but he was drowning too. At Hawthorne, Reed, and Collis, the atmosphere shifted. Meetings grew colder. Invitations disappeared. A senior partner, someone Evan had once admired, made pointed remarks about personal instability and questionable judgment. Evan came home one evening and admitted he feared he was being quietly pushed out. What hurt him most wasn't just the professional consequences. It was the realization that Lydia hadn't simply betrayed him romantically. She had tried to rewrite his reality. To isolate him. To turn him against the one person who had never failed him. Then the lawsuits arrived. Thick envelopes. Formal language. Threats wrapped in legal terminology. They accused both of us of defamation, emotional distress, and intentional interference. The goal was obvious. Intimidate us into silence, scare us into settling, drain us financially. Fear returned sharp and familiar. It reminded me of the early years after Evan's father left, when every envelope in the mailbox felt like a potential disaster. I blamed myself again. I wondered if my quiet endurance had somehow invited this. If staying silent for so long had taught people I could be erased without consequence. That was when Nora Blake stepped in fully. Nora had worked in legal support for nearly 20 years. She didn't speak in comfort, she spoke in facts. She sat at my kitchen table, spread the documents out, and pointed line by line. "This isn't justice," she said. "It's desperation." She explained that Lydia's family was in serious financial trouble. Failed ventures. Unpaid loans. Quiet settlements that never fully settled. The wedding hadn't just been about love, it had been a strategy. Evan's future income had been calculated, planned for, relied upon. Nora told us we needed evidence. Not feelings. Not memories. Proof. So we gathered everything. Emails where Lydia complained about Evan taking pro bono cases instead of higher-paying corporate work. Messages between Lydia and her mother discussing long-term security. Drafts of the prenup that shifted dramatically in favor of Lydia's family. Hotel receipts. Calendar entries. Patterns. What began as pain turned into clarity. Nora connected us with Samuel Reed, an investigative journalist at the Midwest Ledger, known for uncovering financial misconduct hidden behind polished reputations. Samuel listened quietly, asked sharp questions, and took careful notes. He didn't promise anything, but he was interested. Over the next several weeks, Samuel dug deep. He interviewed former employees of Lydia's father's businesses, people who hadn't been paid in months. He spoke with creditors who had been ignored. He obtained anonymous statements from former financial consultants who described reckless investments and deliberate misrepresentation. What emerged wasn't a scandal, it was a pattern. When the article was published, it didn't focus on drama. It focused on facts. The headline didn't mention romance. It mentioned financial exploitation, predatory agreements, and misrepresentation. Legal experts were quoted. Documents were referenced. The story laid everything bare. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. The same people who had avoided me now approached with apologies. Some said they had believed Lydia because she looked so put together. Others admitted they had judged me for being quiet, assuming silence meant guilt. Lydia's online presence changed dramatically. Comments turned critical. Questions replaced sympathy. She stopped posting altogether within days. Her lawyers reached out soon after. They offered to drop the lawsuit if we agreed to a public retraction and signed a non-disclosure agreement. They wanted silence. Finality. Control. Nora advised against it immediately. "You didn't lie," she said. "Silence now would suggest you did." Evan and I talked late into the night. We were tired, drained, ready for peace. But peace built on fear isn't peace at all. We refused. 2 weeks later, the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. An internal review revealed a conflict of interest involving one of the investigators. Connections to Lydia's father that had never been disclosed. Shortly after, Lydia's family quietly left the state. No announcements. No explanations. Just gone. What followed felt strange, like stepping into sunlight after living underground. For the first time in decades, there was space in my life. Real space. Emotional space. Time that didn't belong to survival. I enrolled in evening painting classes at Riverstone Arts Collective, something I had wanted to do since my 30s. The first canvas terrified me. I stared at it for nearly an hour before lifting the brush. When color finally touched the surface, something loosened inside my chest. Painting gave shape to emotions I had buried for years: anger, grief, resilience, hope. I also joined a support group at the Harborview Women's Wellness Center, a place for women navigating complex family trauma. Listening to other stories reminded me that endurance isn't weakness, and that silence, while sometimes necessary, shouldn't be permanent. The therapist who facilitated the group, Dr. Liana Perez, suggested I consider mentoring others. At first, I laughed. I didn't feel wise. I felt tired, but she insisted that lived experience carried weight. 6 months after the canceled wedding, I spoke publicly for the first time. The event was held at North Shore Memorial Hall, part of a small seminar series on family boundaries and emotional resilience. There were only 30 people in the room. I stood at the podium with shaking hands and told the truth, not dramatically, not angrily, just honestly. I spoke about sacrifice, about how love without boundaries can become self-erasure, about how silence may keep the peace but can cost you your voice. When I finished, people didn't clap right away. Some were crying. Others came up afterward and hugged me without saying a word. Evan changed too. He left Hawthorne, Reed, and Collis and opened his own practice downtown, Holloway Legal Advocacy. He focused on clients facing financial manipulation and fraud. People like the version of himself he never expected to become. The firm grew faster than anyone predicted. Watching him rebuild, not from bitterness but from clarity, was one of the greatest privileges of my life. My paintings were later accepted into a small group exhibition at the Crescent Arts Pavilion. Seeing my work on a gallery wall felt unreal. I enrolled in counseling courses at St. Maribel University, sitting in classrooms with students half my age, learning theories that finally gave language to experiences I had lived through. 2 months ago, Evan introduced me to someone new. Her name was Sophia Lane, an environmental policy attorney. She asked thoughtful questions. She listened without interrupting. She treated me like a person, not an obstacle. After she left, Evan smiled and said he had learned to recognize red flags, not just in others, but in himself. Last week, I was invited to speak at the Ohio Women's Resilience Summit. They asked me to talk about rebuilding after betrayal. Standing on that stage, I realized something important. The life that nearly broke me also shaped me. And the silence that once felt like weakness became the foundation for a voice I now know how to use. If this story touched you in any way, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us where you're watching from. You never know who needs to hear that even after betrayal, clarity can rise, and a quiet life can still become a powerful one.